Another good turnout. I don't know if you know Christie. Christie, you're a Sutton Susie, right?
Yep.
And she has done 4 or 5 lectures with us.
Something like that.
And all very interesting. Little history about Christie is she was very involved with the Sturbridge Village as an interpreter, costume interpreter, since 1981, right?
That's right.
And you're still doing that part-time.
Right.
I was just talking to her about a book that she's ready to publish, and it was on some memoirs from, who's the fellow's name?
It was a man named William Lewis. My husband and I discovered his journals some 10 years ago, and also, so we had 150 journals and over 200 account books and receipt books recording his life, and we've spent the last 10 years researching it, and our book is now with the designer, so we're looking forward to having a published book.
That was one of her lectures, and that was a really nice one. Very good. So the Sutton Beauty, I'm sure you read the advance. We just had 5 of them cloned, and a fellow down at UMass did that for us. We painted 2 over at the blacksmith shop, 1 at the 8-lot school. I've got one that we're going to give to the Manchog Pond Association, and one of our members have won one. So that's what kind of prompted this. And there are some apples. As you leave, you can take some. And Joyce is, I thought I saw her here. Oh, Joyce, can you talk about what they are and who they came from? Yeah, so they can take them on the way out so they know what they're taking.
Yes, Christie said they usually had sometimes had an apple tasting, so I contacted Kenny Faulkner, who's a Sutton boy I had in school, and I went over this noontime and picked up some apples. So there's Rhode Island greenings out there. There's two boxes of them, so you can help yourself with those on the way out, and they go way back to 1650 or before. They're a little tart. I tried them this noontime. And then some crab apples, but they're like little tiny apples. They're very pretty. They're red and yellow, and they're kind of sweet. So there's a bag of those out there too. And of course, the Sutton Beauty apple came from Waters Farm. And I'm a Waters descendant. Stephen Waters was my 4th great grandfather. And the house on the other side of the road is where Richard Waters lived. And there were 2 halves of the orchard. One was, the stock was from Connecticut, and one was from Rhode Island. And I'm not sure which one the Sutton Beauty came from. But they were a very hard, firm apple because it took 2 days to get to Boston with a horse and a wagon, and then 2 months to get to England. So you had to have a very hard apple or it would be mush. So I don't know, did you tell them we just planted some apple trees?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can help yourself to apples on the way out.
Take it away.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back in Sutton. I'm class of 1962, so it's been a while since I went to school here and lived here in town. But it's always great to come back, and it's been a real pleasure to make contact with some of the folks that I went to high school with while I've been here today. And I hope if there are others among you that I haven't had a chance to talk to, please give me a chance, but don't count on my being able to remember your name and recognize you. So I'm going to be presenting a program tonight that I call An Infinite Variety of Fruit, and in a few minutes you will see where that phrase comes from. In my research at Old Sturbridge Village, where I coordinated the horticulture program for many years, I was able to use the research library there, and it got me really hooked on early 19th century original sources. I love telling the story of history through the words of the people that actually lived it. And so you'll find a lot of that in my slides tonight. I hope you all had a chance to get a handout. I know if we ran out, Christine said that she would be able to provide people with additional copies of that. So we'll get going. So one of the things I wanted to start with was just to take a look at the infinite variety of fruits that were available. A whole host of different kinds of apples. Most of the images that you see here are photographs that I took in an orchard in Bolton, Massachusetts. Maiden's Blush, so appropriately named. And Grimes Golden, which originated in the South but became a very popular apple up here in New England. So if we look back into the beginning of things, I have a quote here from 1837 from Thomas Bridgman's book. It's one of my favorite apple quotations. The apple, being so closely connected with our wants and enjoyments, is entitled to the first notice in the catalog of our fruits. The apple orchard is in truth the vineyard of our country, and the delicious beverage that can be obtained from some of the varieties of this excellent fruit, being calculated to cheer the invalid as well as to strengthen the healthy, entitles it to high consideration. It is one of our oldest and best fruits, and has become completely naturalized to our soil. None can be brought to so high a degree of perfection with so little trouble, and of no other are there so many different excellent varieties in general cultivation, calculated for almost every soil, situation, and climate which our country affords. In the early 19th century, the time period that we focus on at Old Sturbridge Village, the vast majority of the apples that grew here in New England didn't come to the table in a pie or in your hand. They came in a glass. Cider was where most of the apples ended up. Certainly people did eat apples out of hand and make pies and other desserts out of them, but orchards provided huge quantities of apples to be pressed into cider. And local towns had cider mills. Farmers, often wealthier farmers, would build a cider mill, and it functioned sort of like a laundromat might function today, in that it provided the equipment and the services for other farmers to press their apples into cider. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. The last sentence here, which talks about apples being suited to every soil, situation, and climate which our country affords, is a celebration of the fact that many of the apples that I'm going to be talking about originated in very specific locations, like the Sutton Beauty did. And when you had that kind of origination of apples, you could find an apple tree or an apple variety that was specifically suited for your particular regional conditions. Today, there are many fewer varieties available to us, believe it or not. And we often have to deal with varieties that are more generalized in their application and not so specific to particular regions. The apples that grew here in New England and provided cider grew on farms where a typical cider orchard might have about 30 trees in it. And to provide apple trees in the cider orchard, the least expensive way for the farmer to do that was to plant seedling apple trees. When the apples had been pressed, as I'll show you shortly, to release the juice to make them into cider, the farmer could carry home that pomace, that pressed fruit with its seeds, could dig a trench in a good, by the way, area on his farm, and just put that pomace into it and allow seeds to germinate in the ground. And then promising looking trees, if you were someone who had been working with apple trees for a long time, perhaps since you were a child, you were good at being able to determine from a young tree what might be promising. And so then a farmer could select from these seedling trees, promising trees, young trees, and plant them out into an orchard of 25 or 30 trees or so. Samuel Cole talks about this in 1849 when he writes, "The varieties are innumerable. In many parts of the country, large orchards were set and allowed to produce natural," and by this he means seedling, fruit. Hence, the great variety and excellence of our apples, combining almost every good quality in tree and fruit. We have made an estimate that in the state of Maine, more than 2 million of varieties have been produced, and hundreds and even thousands of kinds may be found there, superior to many recommended in fruit books. Now, why is this so? The reason for that is that apples do not do what is called coming true from seed. And I remember when I learned this, it was one of those aha moments in my own learning experience when Tom Burford, apple historian, came to Old Sturbridge Village, and I learned from him. So if you, for example, had eaten an apple that you thought was really wonderful, and you really enjoyed it, and you held the core in your hand and you said, I want a tree like this, so I'm going to take one of these seeds and plant it and create my own tree, you very likely would not get the result you were seeking. And the reason for this is that in order for the blossom on an apple tree to be fertilized so that it can mature and produce a ripe fruit, that flower has to receive pollen from a tree of a different variety, not from the same variety. There are a very few exceptions to this, but the vast majority of apple trees require pollen in their flower from a tree of a different variety. And so, of course, pollinators like bees are the ones that do the work for us. And they can travel, miles to visit different apple trees. And in a given area, visiting many apple trees of many different kinds and carrying the pollen so that a tree is likely to receive on its flower pollen from a different kind of apple tree. And when that happens, then that flower is fertilized and it will begin to develop fruit. What that means then is the seeds inside that apple are comparable to a human child. Each of those seeds are like the children in a two-parent family. Each one of them has a slightly different combination of the genetic material of father and mother. And so each one of them has the potential, when planted, to produce a brand new tree, one that has never genetically existed before in that same form. So every time one of these farmers planted a seedling cider orchard of, say, 30 trees, that farmer was creating 30 brand new apple varieties. And so the odds that in an orchard like that, a tree would emerge from that mixture of seedling trees that had qualities that were very desirable, that was fairly good odds. If you were going to make cider from your apples, you really didn't require fruit that was exactly predictable. So the best ciders came from a blend of different kinds of apples. Some that might be more tart, more acid, some that might be more sweet, some in fact that might have very high tannins in them and make them really not very tasty to eat out of hand, be like chewing on a tea bag. But that blend of apples made a good cider. So the typical farmer was not worried about the predictability of the varieties of apples in the cider orchard. And that allowed for the emergence of all of these different varieties coming up. And so we'll talk about some of those. And James Thatcher, a physician who wrote The American Orchard and published his book in Plymouth in 1825, he commented on this when he said, "The seeds of apples contain the germ of an infinite variety of fruit. New varieties and some of excellent quality are continually produced from seeds." When I learned this, that was a real aha moment for me, because it really opened up the whole picture of how we have so many different kinds of apples. And one of the earliest of these, to give an example, a concrete example, is the apple known as the Roxbury Russet apple. It's a really interesting looking apple. It almost looks more like a pear than an apple. Its skin on the outside is rough and a little bit coarse, almost sandpapery. And it's this sort of golden color with these patches of kind of rust on the outside of them. And that was what was called russeting on the skin of an apple. So the Roxbury Russet is considered to be the oldest named American-originated variety of apple. There may have been other varieties that originated here in this country. 1649 is a pretty early date for an apple to have originated, and it was named as, you might guess, emerged down in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And William Kendrick speaks about it in his book, The American Orchardist. He writes, "This capital old variety is a native of Massachusetts. Its flesh, white, juicy, rich, subacid, and excellent. An old and famous variety in Massachusetts, a great and constant bearer, it seldom fails. Great quantities of this fruit are raised in the neighborhoods of Boston for the market and for exportation. And although the Baldwin or Hubbardston none such, and perhaps some other winter fruits far exceed this variety in beauty and excellence of flavor, and at least equal it in productiveness, the Roxbury Russet surpasses them all in its property of long keeping. They are fit for use in winter and keep until June or July." And so each of the apples that would emerge in people's orchards could be valued for very different reasons. And a typical family orchard might include specific trees for very particular qualities which they had. Certainly, long keeping was one of the most valuable. I'm going to talk in a little bit about how apples were stored over winter, but a variety that would be not only great to eat fresh off the tree, but which you could store and get from your cellar in the wintertime into the spring, or even, as in the case of the Roxbury Russet, into the early summer months. That was very valuable. And as Joyce mentioned earlier, good qualities for shipping, apples that didn't bruise easily, were very valuable for those who were going to market them and transport them. So many of the apples that emerged became very famous and very desirable for that quality. And one of those is the Baldwin apple. And the Baldwin has a really interesting story. The Horticulturist magazine in 1847 gives the origin story of the Baldwin apple. This justly esteemed fruit originated in Wilmington, near Boston, in that county of Middlesex, Massachusetts. The original tree grew on the farm of Mr. Butters and was known for a time as the Butters apple. This tree was frequented by woodpeckers, and Mr. Butters called it the woodpecker apple, which was soon abbreviated to the pecker apple. This fruit must have been known about a century. Orchards were propagated from Mr. Butters' trees pretty freely. About 75 years since, by Dr. Jabez Brown of Wilmington and Colonel Baldwin of Woburn and their sons, to whom the public are principally indebted for bringing the fruit so generally into notice. And so it's no accident that many of these antique apple varieties often have multiple names. And one of the reasons for that is their fame grew from local fame to broader fame. So in the case of Mr. Butters' apple, that tree emerged in Mr. Butters' orchard. Maybe, perhaps, we could suppose some neighbors might have come for dinner at the Butters' home, and Mrs. Butters might have served apple pie, and it might have been really delicious, and neighbors might have said, "What kind of apples did you use in that?" And Mr. Butters said, "Oh, it was my old woodpecker apple tree that I have in the orchard." And people said, "Wow, these are really good apples. I'd like to have a tree like that." And we'll talk in a minute about how you could get one, because they couldn't just take home the apple and plant the seeds. So Mr. Butters' apple gained its notoriety locally under several names: Butters, Woodpecker, Pecker, and then Mr. Lemuel Baldwin acquired it. And Mr. Baldwin had a nursery and sold apple trees. And the tree had earned its reputation locally, and so he marketed trees, and when he sold them, he gave them his name, the Baldwin, and that's what it became known as after that. And the fruit culturist John J. Thomas, by 1847, the Baldwin apple was the primary apple here in Massachusetts until it was replaced in the 1930s by the Macintosh apple. So the Baldwin really played, if you're familiar with the apple, the Macintosh, the Baldwin in the 19th century played the role that the Macintosh later played. And Thomas said, this apple stands as one of the first among the first, both in quality and great productiveness, and by its way of preeminence, the apple of New England. It was so preeminent because, like the Macintosh apple, it was an apple that could be used for a wide variety of things. It was great to eat out of hand, it was a really good cooking apple, it was very firm, and it was excellent for shipping and marketing. It also stored for a long time, so it ticked all the boxes, and that's what really earned it its reputation. So if you wanted, like Mr. Baldwin, to create dozens and dozens of this tree, identical to the tree that showed up in Mr. Butter's orchard, the way to do that is by grafting. You can't do it by saving seeds because they won't come true, but you can take pieces of an existing tree and join them onto what's called a rootstock, or you could join them onto an existing apple tree, and then you would have the genetically identical material to that tree. And that's how that tree was propagated and then spread all over the place. So a single tree, when farmers would go, as you see in the image here, to a tree and cut scion wood, they would do that in February or March when the tree was dormant and the weather was cool. And what they would be cutting is growth of the last year, the tips of branches, the part that had just grown in the previous year. That growth then would have the capability of being joined to other apple growth. To create a new tree, the common way to do that would be to join that scion wood onto what was called a rootstock. So let's say that the farmer who had taken all that pomace and those seeded apples and he had grown little young trees in a trench, he could choose from that trench a very vigorous looking young tree. A young tree whose trunk was still very small, only about the same diameter as the branch growth that was being cut off the Baldwin apple tree. And by joining the two together, by cutting the top off of the rootstock tree and taking the scion wood from the Baldwin and physically joining them together, that union, that graft union as it would known, would grow together. The two trees would join the cambium layer and become a new tree. So if you own a named variety of apple or pear tree, what you own is a grafted tree. And by grafting, there were several advantages in addition to the fact that you would now have the variety you wanted. Grafting, transferring that scion wood with a few buds onto a stick or a limb, so it could be joined onto an existing tree, and then they would grow, the tree would grow with the same variety as the scion wood. And the advantages included several. For one, that a valuable kind of tree could be propagated very rapidly. In the winter months, you could cut hundreds of new branches from an existing tree. Each one of those then could become a completely new tree when it was joined to a seedling rootstock. The fruit could be, if that particular tree didn't do well on a particular kind of soil, you could take the scion wood and you could graft it onto a rootstock of a variety that did do well on that soil, and now you could have the fruit you wanted on a tree that would be healthy in your own soil. So that was another advantage of the grafting. And you could make a tree into a dwarfing variety. So rootstocks were grown, young trees were grown of different types to create the height, so it's the rootstock of the tree that determines how big the full tree is going to get. And the scion wood is what determines what kind of apples you're going to get from your tree. So you could join that scion wood onto a rootstock that was dwarfing, that was going to make a tree that wouldn't get any taller than maybe 8 or 10 feet tall, and you could have a dwarf tree. Or you could join it onto a seedling apple tree that was what's called a standard apple that would get up to 15 or 30 feet tall and have a large tree. So you could choose the size tree that you were going to have and graft it to the fruit that you wanted. And as the report from Cole says here, by several varieties in the same tree, a succession of fruit may be had in a small garden, and by selecting various beautiful fruits, a tree may be rendered highly ornamental as well as useful. So by grafting, you could create a single fruit tree that would bear 5 or 6 different kinds of apples on one tree. That would allow for the mixture of fruits, of flowers for the pollination that you would need for your tree, and it would allow for someone with a very small piece of ground to have a number of different kinds of apples growing on their property. So here is just some images from Samuel Cole's American Fruit Book that show some of the different kinds of grafting. So most traditional grafting is what's called splice grafting. And so the lower piece here would be the rootstock cut on a slant and then a slit put into that slanted edge. The top piece is the scion wood that was taken off of the desirable tree, and it was cut to match with a similar slant and another slit. When those two were slid together, the slits would fit together, and the cambium layer, that layer just inside the bark of the tree, which is where the fluids in the tree move from the root up to the top, the cambium layers would line up and match in those two pieces, and then they would grow together to form the graft union. Another way to graft is what was called budding. This one is the most common for creating new trees. Budding was cutting a bud from the fruit tree that you desired, making a slit in the bark of an existing tree and slipping that bud into that slit and then binding it so that it would grow in, and then you would produce a branch that would come out from an existing tree, and the fruit on that branch would be your desired fruit. So you could bud several varieties onto an existing tree. Or if you wanted to cut a tree back, this is called cleft grafting. So here an existing tree has been cut and a cleft cut in it, and then scion wood is cut with at an angle like you see here, only on both sides, pointed, and then slipped into that cleft. And when that kind of grafting is done, people will usually put more than one scion into the cleft, and they will watch them grow, and then they would select the strongest one to become the existing tree and cut the others back. And so among the numerous varieties of fruit-bearing trees cultivated in our country, the apple is confessedly of superior importance and utility, whether considered as an esculent for the dessert, as an article for culinary purposes, or as affording a pleasant and wholesome beverage. This fruit is not to be surpassed in excellence. And so these are the three main uses for the apple, of course. It was the pressing into cider, using as a whole fruit, eating it as an out-of-hand, what was called a dessert apple, or cooking it, using it for culinary purposes. And some apples could do all of those things. Some apples were good at one of those in particular. And so by the 19th century, and the common situation was that a typical farm is going to have an orchard, as you see here in this image of the Chandler Farm in Woodstock, Connecticut, painted around 1850. It'd be very common to find an orchard on a farm property. And it could now consist of seedling trees that might be used primarily for cider making, and some named apple varieties that the family would use for specific purposes, for storing in their house, for eating out of hand, or for cooking apples. So this is pages of a catalog from Boston area. This was William Kenrick's nursery. Kenrick's nursery was a very famous nursery in Newton, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. And this is the catalog from Kenrick's nursery from his 1833-1834 catalog. And it's his catalog of fruit and hardy ornamental trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants. And what I'm going to show you are just the pages listing apple varieties for sale in 1833. And I want you to think if you've seen this many apple varieties in any of the catalogs you get now. So he has his apples divided up by whether they were American originated or foreign originated apples, whether they are good for cider, for dessert, and other purposes. And the list is comprised of over 200 different named varieties of apples. And it includes celebrated cider apples. So what was happening was many people, of course, were still using the seedling apples that didn't have any designated names, but apples had emerged that cider makers found very predictable as good for cider making, and so now people were buying named varieties of apples specifically for making cider as well, and Kenrick offers a selection of those. So Samuel Cole, in his advice to the farmer, talks about harvesting these apples. So we're getting into apple harvest season, starting up pretty soon now. And he says, gather apples in dry weather and pick winter fruit and all dessert fruit by hand and handle it in every way with care to prevent bruising. So he's talking about selecting the apples that you're going to store in your cellar to keep over winter, or those that you're going to use for dessert, for eating out of hand. Cider apples could be harvested because they're going to be taken to the mill pretty quickly and crushed. You don't have to be as fussy about how you harvest those, but he cautions that dessert apples and winter keeping apples need to be harvested with care. And then those apples that you're going to store are going to go into the root cellar. This is an image of the root cellar at the Freeman farm at Old Sturbridge Village. Root cellars tended to be a place to store a wide variety of different kinds of farm produce. They take their name from the fact that bins of sand stored carrots and beets and turnips and parsnips, root vegetables, which keep in those bins of sand because those root vegetables are biennial plants. They're plants that are programmed by nature to live for 2 years. When you harvest a carrot at this time of the year, or if you were going to store it in the root cellar, you'd wait until we had had a little bit of frost to make the carrot go dormant between its first and second year. Then you could just lift it from the ground, pack it in bins of sand in the cellar, and if it was carefully packed, it would not rot because it's not dead. It's just waiting out the time between its first year of growth and its second year of growth. That was another aha learning experience for me at Old Sturbridge Village because I had grown carrots for decades in my own garden. And when I heard that, I said to myself, well, you fool. Why didn't you ever wonder, after you had put all those carrot seeds in the ground, why you had never seen any seeds on your carrot plant? And that was because I ate it at the end of its first year, and it wasn't going to produce any seeds until a second year of growth, which people don't do unless they're growing them for seed. So, root cellar is a good place to store those apples. One of the tricky things about storing apples in the root cellar, though, most people only had one cellar. Some people had a root cellar and a fruit storage cellar if they were doing more business with fruit. If you store your apples alongside of things like your potatoes, you can cause your potatoes to ripen prematurely. And that's because in storage, apples give off ethylene gas, which is a stimulant to ripen other things. So ideally, you would want to store your apples separately from your root vegetables and your potatoes, but that didn't happen in most people's cellars because most people didn't have the luxury of more than one space. So then, of course, in the fall, it's going to be cider making season. If orchards with the ruddy apples glow, now with the juice let cider presses flow. Lo, orchard, garden, and the cultured field, rich loads of all the golden harvest yield. And we have a cider mill at Old Sturbridge Village where we can demonstrate the cider making process each year. And as I mentioned, many times these mills were owned by wealthier farmers who would build them, and then people would bring their apples to the mill and do the pressing of the juice to take it home to let it ferment into a fermented cider that would then store, because it was fermented, in barrels for months to come in the cellar of the house. You would pay the farmer for the use of his equipment like we do when we go to a laundromat. And if you had your own horse to power the cider equipment, then you wouldn't have to pay for that. But if you didn't, you could pay the farmer for the use of a horse as well. So the farmer who owns the mill can earn money, and sometimes he would accept payment in the form of cider, which he could then either keep himself or sell. And these cider mills, most towns have these cider mills scattered here and there throughout the town to make the pressing easier. And the first step in the cider pressing process is crushing the apples, and that's done with a device called a nut mill, because of these spokes, these nuts, which crush or break up the fruit of the apples, and that's powered by a horse that pulls the sweep around and turns that. So that's step one. Step two is forming what's called the cheese. This is not the dairy cheese, but it's called a cheese because of the process. Dairy cheese is made by pressing it in a cheese press, and apple cider is made by pressing the apples in a press in the same way. So the term cheese is used for that. So on the press, the pomace, the crushed up apples, is spread on straw and in layers, and then that straw, the edges of that straw is turned over the layers of pomace to form the cheese, and then these planks are put on top, and the screws are pushed down to press the planks and squeeze out the juice. And as the writer says here, this is the part of the operation of cider making on which much of the excellence of the liquor will be found to depend. When skillfully done, it completely separates the juice from the pulp. So the juice will be pressed out, and on the press, it's grooved to provide a channel for that juice to flow off the press and to be captured, and then it can be poured into the barrels and bunged up to allow it to ferment. So cider making was a really important part of the fall routine here in New England, and cider was the most common fermented beverage. Hard cider was consumed by all ages. The hard part of it, the fermented part of it, is done, of course, to preserve it, to protect it. It wasn't so much just to make it a fermented beverage that would get you drunk, but a fermented beverage that would not spoil. And so apple cider came from an English tradition that was continued for a long time. And as I mentioned, some of the varieties of apple, like Granny Winkle, which originated in New Jersey around 1800, were selected specifically for the good role that they played in producing an excellent cider. And agricultural societies annually, and we still have our annual agricultural fairs in many towns here in New England. They go back a long, long ways. One of the goals of the agricultural fair was education. Instead of farmers competing and keeping secrets about what they did, what they fed to their cow that gave them the greatest yield and the best high cream quality of their milk, farmers shared that information with one another. The goal of the agricultural society was to improve agriculture throughout the community, and so coming together at the fair each year would allow people to share information. It also was a great way to promote locally produced varieties of fruit. So people could come in and see some of the apples and other fruits on display, taste them, learn more about them, and then improve and increase the varieties in their own orchards. And so this is how some of those locally originated varieties of seedling apples began to get the word out and have it spread. So it's going to just take a look at some of the key interesting varieties that played a role in this. As I mentioned, when we looked at Kenrick's cataloging, there were thousands and thousands. I can't possibly cover all of them, but I've chosen a few key varieties that might help tell the story about these apples. A couple of the first two I'm going to start with are English varieties of apples, because this is where the whole thing started. The apple actually originated in Central Europe, and apples had been cultivated for centuries before anyone brought them to this country. But they were some of the very first fruits to be brought here, both as fruit, as scionwood, and as trees to this country. And when apple varieties like the Ribston Pippin came here, and Ribston Pippin, the word Pippin is an Old English word for a seedling. So Ribston Pippin started as a seedling in England, and then it was brought here. And when it was planted here, seedling apples from it then provided the genes for new varieties here. And it was esteemed for its rich flavor, its high quality, and it was very desirable both for a dessert apple and a culinary apple. This is a picture of some Ribston Pippins I no longer have, but I did have at one time a dwarf Ribston Pippin tree, and it's one of my absolute favorite apples for eating out of hand. It's a really good apple. So these are pictures of some Ribston Pippin apples that I harvested back in, I think, 2015. Another apple that I just love, it's an English-originated variety, is the Cox's Orange Pippin. And it originated around 1830, was raised by a man named Richard Cox, from which it takes its name, and it was said to have been a seedling of the Ribston Pippin. And so this is one of the next generation of apples, and it's regarded as one of the classic dessert apples of the world. It's called an effervescent apple, like the Isopa Spitzenberg that I'll be mentioning. When you bite into it, the flavor, it's almost like a carbonated beverage in a way. The flavor kind of matures in your mouth, and it has this effervescent quality to it. The black gillyflower, or sheep-nose apple, originated in Connecticut, and it takes its name, as you can see, from its shape. When you hold it up horizontally, it really looks like a sheep's head with a pointed sheep's nose. It's an apple that isn't, I don't think, really great eating out of hand. It has good flavor, but it's very dry. But this made this apple a favorite for people who wanted to dry apples for storage. Since the apple is dry to begin with, it dried very quickly and retained its flavor when dry. And so, again, people would often, when you had numerous trees or a multi-grafted tree, you might want to have very specific varieties for very specific purposes. And the black gillyflower was an excellent apple for drying, for making dried apples, to preserve them. The Rhode Island Greening, which Joyce has brought several of, is one of the oldest American-originated apples. It is said to have originated around the area called Green's End in Newport, Rhode Island, and it existed by 1650. They don't have an exact origination date, but that was the first date that they can document it as. It's an apple, right now it's probably a little bit early for its best flavor harvest. That's another thing that I learned about, was that these trees will have very specific times when their flavor is at their best, and it's not always when they first look like you want to eat them. Sometimes you have to leave them for a little bit of chilling, and in fact some of the antique apple varieties actually improve their flavor in storage. And so the Ribston Pippin and Cox's Orange Pippin are like that. People would put them, in England, would put them into storage and then bring them up a couple months later when their flavor was at their peak. The Rhode Island Greening was favored primarily as a culinary apple. The green apple we all buy in our supermarkets now.
Granny Smith?
Granny Smith apple. The Granny Smith apple is the modern apple that kind of stepped into the role that had been played for centuries by Rhode Island Greening. And this one is still, if you can obtain it, an excellent pie or cooking apple. It's tart to eat out of hand, but that makes it a wonderful cooking apple for blending with spices and sugars.
I neglected to tell you that Kenny Faulkner bought Keown's orchard, so these apples out here were grown in Sutton.
Ah, yes. Good. Local. The blue pearmain is a really interesting apple. We've had these at apple tastings at Old Sturbridge Village. This is one that the origin of this apple is, it's believe very strongly to be an American originated apple, but its exact origin is quite uncertain. It first appears documented in 1833. It's a really tasty, wonderful apple for eating out of hand, and it's also great for cooking. And it takes its name, blue pearmain, from the fact that when it's growing, it has this, what's called a blue bloom on the outside. It almost looks kind of cloudy on the outside of the apple. That's perfectly natural to the fruit, so it's the blue pearmain apple. And it's another early apple that's really a really delicious choice. The Northern Spy is a fairly well-known apple. Probably many of you have heard of that one. It's also sometimes called Northern Pie apple. It makes a large apple, and it is an excellent apple for cooking and for pies. It's still quite available if you find the right kind of heirloom orchards, and there are several several orchards that feature heirloom fruits here within easy driving distance of this part of New England. This one, Samuel Cole said of it that it was remarkable for its freshness after long keeping, winter, spring, and into summer. So this was one of the apples that could be stored away in the cellar and it would keep its qualities for months. The golden russet is another one of my favorites. It's like the Northern Spy. Its origins are a little bit uncertain. Nobody knows exactly where it came from. It's believed that it's probably a seedling of an English russet apple, probably dates from the 18th century. And it, like this gives you again a sense of the Roxbury russet, what russet apples are like. They're these golden apples with these kind of patches of kind of rustiness on the outside of the skin that make them really look very pear-like. And this one is an excellent apple to eat out of hand. It's my favorite apple for making applesauce. We have a tree of it at Old Sturbridge Village, and I love cooking with it in one of the houses there to make it into applesauce. Isopa Spitzenberg is an apple with a really neat name. Part of its name comes from its origin in Esopus, New York. It dates from the late 1700s, and it's an apple that a lot of its fame comes from the fact that Thomas Jefferson loved this apple, and we have accounts of him ordering trees from William Prince's nursery. It's a very famous nursery in New York in the 1800s, and Jefferson grew the Isopa Spitzenberg apple on his orchard at Monticello. And it's a classic American dessert apple. This one, like the Cox's orange Pippin, the English apple, is effervescent. When you bite into it, your mouth kind of is very sprightly. It's sort of like a carbonated beverage in your mouth, and it changes from a kind of acid to a sweet and mingles. It's a really fabulous, if you ever get a chance to taste some of these, they're really remarkable apples. John Thomas, in his fruit culturist book, referred to it as unexcelled. Coming a little more local, the mother apple or the American mother, as it was sometimes called. I have a mother tree in my little dwarf espaliered apple orchard at home, and it's one of my favorites because, of course, I'm a mother and grandmother. Never heard of a grandmother tree, though. The mother apple originated in Bolton, and it's one of the most reliable trees in my orchard in terms of fruiting. And as Cole says, Samuel Cole says here, the flesh is very tender, almost melting, mild, rich, highly aromatic, with a delightful mingling of slightly subacid and saccharine qualities. In quality, it has no superior and very few equals. So this is a very, very locally originated apple from Bolton, Mass. And then another Massachusetts originated apple, the Westfield Seek No Further. So this one got its name because somebody felt like this was the penultimate apple. You didn't have to look any further after you had one of these. And it is indeed, when we did apple tastings at Old Sturbridge Village, we have Westfield Seek No Further tree in one of the orchards there and used the fruit from that. And we always asked people to rank the apples in that tasting, and this one always came out right up at the top. People really loved that one. From Westfield near Springfield, Massachusetts. Before the middle of the 1800s, this apple arose, and in 1846, the Committee of the New York State Agricultural Society on the selection of the best varieties of apples for cultivation in New York reported concerning this particular variety. This truly excellent apple originated in Westfield or its neighborhood, a beautiful meadow town about 10 miles west of Springfield in the Connecticut Valley in Massachusetts. For many miles up and down and round about that river, it is the apple par excellence of that locality. Whole orchards are planted of this fruit, and nowhere does it flourish in higher luxuriance and perfection. In flavor is excelled by few apples whatever for all household purposes. Wherever it will grow, its cultivation is recommended, both for domestic and market purposes. And so then, another local apple, similar to the Seek No Further, this is the Nonesuch, again, the penultimate apple, originating in Hubbardston, Massachusetts. And it's considered, the Hubbardston Nonesuch is considered one of likely the parent of your Sutton Beauty apple. That's not been proven, but many historic sources claim that the Hubbardston Nonesuch was very likely the parent apple from which the seed was taken that produced the Sutton Beauty apple. And this one, again, was considered extremely popular both for home use and also for marketing. And that brings us to the Sutton Beauty apple. Originating here on Waters Farm in Sutton, Massachusetts in the 1700s. The exact date varies depending on which source you look to. And I'm sure there are folks in the audience here who probably have some additional research to what I have on the Sutton Beauty, and I would be really happy to hear about sources that you might have locally for the origination of this apple. But one of the sources that I ran across that I really enjoyed, and I've taken a quote from this, this is Charles Hovey published a magazine of horticulture in Boston in the 1800s, and in 1849, he wrote about the fact that this apple had been exhibited by the Worcester County Horticultural Society. So the date, the reported date of 1848 is based on that exhibit. Everyone acknowledged that the apple had been around locally for a long time before that, but in 1849, Hovey reported, there are quite a number of seedling apples cultivated in Worcester County, and some of them appear to possess great merit. Recently, through the influence of the Worcester County Horticultural Society, whose exhibitions of fruit, particularly of apples, have been remarkably fine, many of these seedlings have been, for the first time, brought to the notice of pomologists. Our correspondents, Messrs. Earl and Jakes of Worcester, sent us some specimens of the Sutton Beauty, which we had the pleasure of seeing upon the tables of the Society at the annual exhibition last September. And we have found it so excellent an apple, as well as one of the most beautiful with which we are acquainted, that we have given it a place in our descriptive list of select varieties, with the belief that it will become a very popular fruit. And so this was just the year after the Worcester County Horticultural Society formally exhibited it and kind of introduced it to the larger general public. And by 1871, Charles Downing, who was the brother of Andrew Jackson Downing. Andrew Jackson Downing was killed when he was quite young in a steamboat accident, and his brother Charles took over some of the books that Downing had been writing, including his Fruits and Fruit Trees of America. And in it, Charles Downing edited that book, and in it is another mention of the Sutton Beauty. Now its fame had moved out to New York State, and he writes in the end of his description here that the flesh is yellowish, half fine, crisp, tender, juicy, rich, mild, subacid, slightly aromatic, very good. And all of the 19th century sources talk about its maturity coming late, that it was often harvested early, but its flavor was a winter apple, so the flavor matured. And they mention between November and February being the peak of flavor for this variety. And the little drawing that you see here is the one that Downing included. So some of the early apple books don't have, the earliest ones don't have colored images of the fruit, but these little cutaway drawings are very common representatives in the apple literature. Later on, in 1911, this watercolor was done by the artist Deborah Passmore Griscom, and it is in the United States Department of Agriculture has a whole watercolor collection of portraits of various American-originated trees, and the Sutton Beauty is in that collection. It shows up in this picture as Sutton Beauty, and in this other watercolor from the USDA's collection, it's just listed as Sutton. Like many of the apples, it shows up with slightly different names in different sources, but Sutton and Sutton Beauty are two of its most common names. And so I'm going to close with one of my favorite apple quotes from the 19th century, and it's from a cookbook writer. Actually, it's 18th century. Amelia Simmons's quote came from her American cookery book, which is one of the earliest American cookbooks, and she writes, apples are still more various, yet rigidly retain their own species, and are highly useful in families, and ought to be more universally cultivated, excepting in the compactest cities. There is not a single family but might set a tree in some otherwise useless spot which might serve the twofold use of shade and fruit, on which 12 or 14 kinds of fruit trees might easily be engrafted, and essentially preserve the orchard from the intrusions of boys, etc., which is common in America. If the boy who thus planted a tree and guarded it and protected it in a useless corner and carefully engrafted different fruits was to be indulged free access into orchards, whilst the neglectful boy was prohibited, how many millions of fruit trees would spring into growth, and what a saving to the Union! The net saving would in time extinguish the public debt and enrich our cookery. And so she was seeing the engrafting of apple trees by responsible boys as being the way to save the natural debt. And still a good idea to try and maintain a multi-grafted tree. If you think you can't have room for an orchard, you might have room for one tree with 12 or 14 different varieties grafted onto it. And so thank you very much. I will close with that. Questions?
Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us. My question is, the Baldwin apple, all the Baldwin apples that we have now come from grafts from that original one tree.
Right, you can trace it, yeah, you can trace, the question was that all the Baldwin apples that we have can trace back to that one tree. And yes, that's true. I mean, the cyanwood was taken from different generations as they progressed out, but that one tree is that ancestor tree that started the whole process. Yes?
What is the range of the life of one tree?
the question is, what is the range, the length of life of one tree? That will depend really on the root stock that it's grafted onto. Dwarf trees have shorter lifespan than standard trees. So we generally lump most of our apple trees into 3 size categories. There's the dwarf, the semi-dwarf, and the standard. The standard tree is the size that an apple tree will grow in its natural form. It will get close to 30 feet tall. And those trees can live for hundreds of years. There are still surviving apple trees in places that go back to the 1800s in some places. So the standard tree has the longest life cycle. The dwarf tree has a shorter life cycle. And that's just because of the size of the whole tree is less large, and that includes the root ball of the tree, and that's going to influence the length of time that it's going to be able to live. But there are some very old dwarf trees as well. If they're properly cared for, you can have a dwarf tree for 25 years or more. But the standard is the one that's going to have the really long lifespan.
So 75 varieties at one time in the world, supposedly. But you're saying Maine at one time they were saying 2 million?
Well, that was what the quote gave us, yeah. And even there's an orchardist in Maine now who is spending a lot of his time traveling around Maine, finding these different trees and then trying to identify them. Relatively recently, people have been able to use genetic identifications to try and track down the background of some of these trees, something that couldn't be done a long time ago. And a lot of these are trees that varieties that just never went beyond even sometimes one person's property. You know, it was a tree that somebody developed and saved on their own property, or it might have just been a few local people that adopted it. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, one of the real advantages of this approach to apples was that it celebrated trees that were very well adapted to very specific kinds of locations. So Mr. Butters' tree, for example, not only had an apple that everybody really liked, but it was a tree that did really well in that area. It did well in the soil, it did well with the weather conditions, it was able to combat local diseases and insect problems. And so these trees would often not travel very far. They might stay just within a region. Some of them went further. The Sutton Beauty, for example, which I forgot to mention when we had it on the screen, it became a very popular apple in New York State when it went out there. And it was grown in Minnesota as well. So some of the trees that originated in New England were very adaptable to other regions. And now, part of what happened was we had fewer and fewer orchards and fewer family orchards. And so the decisions about which apples people would buy from nurseries, if it comes down to mostly commercial orchards, a few commercial orchards in certain parts of the country, then those are the big buyers. They're the ones that tell the people that are selecting varieties for sale which kinds are the most popular. And what they often choose are varieties that will meet the needs and the tastes of the widest variety of people. So varieties that are suited for one very specific kind of location or that have a very specific quality, like their winter keeping or their value in a pie, for example. Some of those got lost because the big growers wanted these all-purpose apples, and they wanted apples that could, well, people in the 19th century did as well, apples that could ship really well, that you could pack onto a big trailer truck and haul off to a supermarket, and also apples that looked attractive. And some of the most attractive looking apples are not necessarily the best tasting ones. And my complaint in that department is the one known as the Red Delicious, which I think is totally misnamed, having tasted a lot of much more delicious antique apples that may look a little bit odd in the hand, like the Russets, for example, but just taste wonderful. So there were all these small little varieties scattered here and there all over the place. And when those small orchards went out of existence, they just disappeared, and commercial companies just didn't pick them up.
So is that John Bunker that's going around?
Yes, John Bunker. Yeah. And he does, if you're interested in tastings, on the first weekend in November in Deerfield, Massachusetts, a group of orchards out there sponsor a program called Cider Days in Deerfield. They feature a lot of ciders, but they also do apple tastings, and John Bunker comes down from Maine. My original mentor, unfortunately not with us any longer, Tom Burford, whose book I recommend. I have it here if you want to take a look at it after the talk. John Bunker and Tom Burford's from Virginia. They used to do a wonderful North versus South apple tasting at the Cider Days in Deerfield. But many of the orchards out in that area do feature heirloom varieties alongside of really fine modern varieties of apples as well. And they do cider tastings and apple tastings for that weekend program.
I'm sitting here wondering how much variety happens, one of these particular apples that you mentioned, because you told us that the apple is going to be a reflection of the tree, but it's also a reflection of what he brought in as pollen. So doesn't that give you a hope? You know, how do you talk about one type of apple when it's being pollinated from several others?
Right, yeah, the question is, you know, the potential, when you're talking, again, when you're talking about one apple flower being pollinated by bees that might have visited, you know, that tree, for example, individual flowers on one apple tree could be pollinated with pollen from dozens of other trees. And each one of the apples that each of those flowers creates then has a different genetic blending of two trees. So again, I like to use the human child analogy. You know, the apple is sort of like the family. Each of the seeds in it have the same, in that one apple, with that one blossom, each of the seeds have the same two parents. But just like in a human family, the potential for differences in appearance and other genetically inherited traits is very different from one child to another. It can be in a single apple. And when you multiply that potential for all the apples on one tree, and then multiply it again for the potential in all the apples in a 30-tree orchard, and then multiply it again in 1800s in New England, when the vast majority of farms here, and farming was the dominant occupation, the vast majority of farms had an orchard of maybe a minimum of 12 or 15 trees and a maximum of over 30, 40 or 50 trees. You know, the potential for creating new apples is mind-boggling. It's hard to get your head around it.
You haven't mentioned Johnny Appleseed.
Oh, I haven't mentioned Johnny Appleseed. Yeah, and Johnny Appleseed planted seedling apples. So he carried seeds with him and planted those apples. And so what he was doing, again, was he was disseminating new varieties of apples. And, you know, I never realized that until I was told about the, you know, the genetics, how the genetics of apples work. There are a couple of apple varieties. The one that sticks in my mind is one that's a Canadian-originated apple. It's known by a couple different names. It's called either Snow or Fameuse's apple. It's a 19th century apple, but still around. That one does come true from seed. So there are some exceptions to that rule, but the majority of apples do not come true from seed.
Okay, I noticed when you're showing the pictures of the apples in the slice, that every apple brand seeds were in different places in the core. Is that natural? I mean, can you tell an apple by where the seeds are setting inside the core?
Ah, this is the artist speaking. I noticed the drawings. Yeah, there are a whole lot of features when you begin reading apple descriptions in the very complicated literature. Well, like the some of the Department of Agriculture descriptions of fruit varieties, the descriptions get extremely complex. And the core of the apple is a part of that description. So yeah, if you compare, what we would look at first probably, most of us, is just the overall shape of the apple. Is it round? Is it oblong? And so forth. But then the stem end, the calyx end on the bottom, the core on the inside, all of these are identifying characteristics of the apple. I'm not sophisticated enough to be able to make all those distinctions myself, but when you look at a whole bunch of those illustrations, and a lot of these source books, if this kind of research intrigues you, can be found as digitized editions online. That's where some of my images have come from. I use 3 different online digitized libraries for my research. One of them is called Biodiversity Heritage Library. The other is called Hathitrust, Hathitrust, and the other is archive.org. All of those libraries are kind of umbrellas that have access to digitized collections from colleges and universities. So you can use those sources. You can go on and see the actual digitized images of these antique books on fruit and flip your way through and read the sources and look at the images. I do that kind of research a lot now. I like going to Sturbridge Village's research library where I can hold the book right in my hand, and I do own a couple of those books myself because I enjoy them so much. But the digitized versions, if you enjoy that research, and if you do and you want me to give you those names again, just check with me at the end and I'll be glad to share those. Okay. One more.
Orchard apples. Where can you find them?
Where can we find the apples? Okay. Where can you find Baldwins? Yeah, Baldwins are actually some of the ones that are more readily available. And if there are others of you who know, orchards that feature a lot of heirloom apples, feel free to raise your hand and bring those up, because I don't have the whole complete list. But ones that I have used are Neshoba Valley Winery's orchard. When we used to do tastings at Old Sturbridge Village, we would use apples from the village, but we also would supplement with apples from Neshoba Valley Winery. Their heirloom apple collection up there now, in order to pick those, you have to make a special appointment to do it. You used to be able to just go up, but you have to have a special appointment day to go up and do that. They don't open up the heirloom trees to the general public. You have to have an appointment. Another one that I enjoy is out in Deerfield. I got to know this orchard through Cider Days, and it's called Clarkdale. It's a 3rd generation of farm orchard, Clarkdale Orchard in Deerfield. You can access them via their online website, which will tell you varieties that they are currently picking and offering. I know this year I'm on their email line, and this year, because of the drought, many orchards have fewer apples this year. Their production is down in numbers. The flavor of the apples is often really good because they're high sugar content, because they're not as watery. So that one in Deerfield. Bolton Orchards out in Bolton has some heirloom varieties. I'm pretty sure they have Baldwin. And I know some of the local orchards here have 1 or 2 varieties in their collections as well. Well, you mentioned that Fockelmas have the Rhode Island Greening, and perhaps he has others. Right now it's a little bit early. Most of the heirloom varieties, one that's a Danish import, Gravenstein, that's one of the earliest ripening ones. Those come ripe in August and that's a really good cooking apple. It's a great pie apple. So you might find those. That's an old 18th century variety. But most of the heirloom varieties of apples ripen in October and early November. And one reason for that is one of the values, the high values that was placed on apples was winter storage. And apples that ripen really early are not long keepers in the winter. It's the ones that come ripe later that are the best long-keeping apples. And so a lot of heirloom varieties of apples tend to be later, reaching their peak of flavor and ripening a little bit later. So again, around the time of the cider days and first weekend in November, October and early November are good times for heirloom varieties. Okay, well, I don't want to hold people too long, and I'm happy to answer some individual questions, but I don't want to hold people up if they need to leave. So thank you again very much for inviting me. Apples of North America for a great history, but also good advice on culture, caring for grafting, that kind of thing.